Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Landon Holder in Los Angeles, California. Landon is a professional custom clothier at Balani Custom Clothiers, specializing in men's tailored clothing. Landon has also worked as a store manager at Brooks Brothers and an assistant manager at Men's Warehouse. Landon, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I mentioned to you before we got started that this is a very important topic. I've been wanting to cover it for a long time. And I'm excited to be able to ask you a lot of questions. I think later in the interview, we're going to transition to listener questions. We got a ton of listener questions on this topic, so I'm just really excited. So we'll launch into the very first question, which is, when it comes to dressing for an interview, what kind of suit should we be looking for?
Well, the basic tenets of interview dress are really that it should be a dark suit, nothing too flashy, obviously, but not too formal. Black tends to be inappropriate for the business world and for daytime dress. So if you're looking at getting a good interview suit and one that you can wear to a lot of different occasions, it should normally be gray or navy blue. Those are the two most versatile colors, not only in terms of mixing and matching, but also in terms of occasion.
Okay, that's good to know. And in terms of the navy blue, if we went with that color, what color shoes do you wear with that kind of suit?
Well, there are two schools of thought on that. A lot of gentlemen will wear black shoes with a navy suit. And in the instance of an interview, it's not a bad idea because it's a little bit more under the radar, more subtle. I, however, tend to think that brown is more complementary to navy blue, and it's better for everyday wear.
Okay, that's interesting. Well, so, buying a suit can be a pretty intimidating experience. And we were talking just before we started that, if it's our first time buying a suit and we walk into a store, sometimes it can be just really, really overwhelming. If it is our first time, in your opinion, what should we keep in mind when we go in to buy a suit?
Yeah, definitely. The experience is kind of going to make or break how you feel about wearing your suit in the future. And when it comes down to it, really it should be an experience that's guided by a good sales associate who really knows what they're doing and what you should be wearing and the why of what it is that you're wearing. If you get somebody who doesn't really know what they're talking about, it can be especially troubling because you don't know if you've gotten good advice or not. I would say, approach a couple of different stores. Even though it is a little intimidating, once you get past the front door, you're either going to be welcomed and greeted and given an education on the topics that you're looking for, or you'll know right away that you should probably explore other venues.
I mean, what should happen, when we walk in? You said someone should greet us and they should really kind of help us to figure things out.
Yeah, absolutely. A well-practiced sales associate will be able to ask you the appropriate questions in order to find out exactly what you need in your wardrobe. So in the instance of buying, let's say, your first suit for an interview, that should be one of the questions that comes up is what brings you in today? And when you tell them that you have an interview coming up, they say, oh, well, do you need a suit for it? And the conversation kind of flows from there. They'll ask you a little bit about what type of interview it is, what kind of job place, what it is that you're going to be using it for in the future, and also kind of match things a little bit more towards your color palette. Obviously, navy looks better on some people and gray looks better on others.
Oh, that's really interesting. So when we go into a store and we're looking for a suit, I guess one option is we can just buy something right off the rack and wear it. But I believe that there are some other options besides just buying a suit right off the rack. Can you talk us through kind of what those other options are?
Absolutely. You can buy clothes off the rack, and actually Brooks Brothers, who I used to work for, kind of championed ready-made clothing back in the 1800s. That actually wasn't really a common practice at the time. Most people had their clothing made by a tailor, and that option is still available. You can buy ready-made suits, and some people fit right into them quite nicely. Most people have, sort of a different body type than something off the rack, and that causes them to be a little bit uncomfortable in the garment, and that's really where they get their first experience with custom clothing. Now, custom clothing, there's a few different types of custom clothing. There is where you pick out a fabric and lining, and they cut a stock pattern for you with the features of your choice. That's kind of your entry-level custom stuff. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, there is made-to-measure. Made-to-measure is a modification of a stock pattern according to your body type. So you'll have, maybe 25 different alterations that you can adjust and tweak in order to make the suit fit you a lot better. And of course, you get to choose the fabric and the lining and the features and everything else like that. What we do at Balani Custom Clothiers is bespoke clothing, which is not based on a stock pattern. We take your measurements and we put together some allowances to create a garment specifically for you and your body type. We're not modifying anything. We are cutting it from scratch, and that pattern belongs solely to you. So that is the fullest level of customization that you can really get.
Oh, that's so interesting. So do you, if someone were to come in and work with you on a fully custom suit, and do you keep the pattern on file so that in the future you might make another suit for that same person?
Absolutely. Once we cut your paper pattern at the factory and make any necessary adjustments to it later, that paper pattern hangs on a hook in the factory indefinitely until you come back and order up another suit or sport coat or something else like that.
Oh, that's interesting. I actually have a friend who does this, who gets custom-made suits, and he actually doesn't even go in all that often. He will call the company that he works with, and they'll just whip him up another whatever he needs because they have all his measurements on file, and that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes the process much easier after the initial fitting. If you're in need of another navy blue or charcoal gray suit, and you really trust your styling associate, then you can just call it in. They'll whip up a suit for you, and we'll deliver it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned to you another time when we were talking that I've actually had a custom suit made before. And for me, the real benefit, I think, is that my arms and legs are different lengths. And pretty significantly, surprisingly different lengths. So having a custom suit made allowed me to be sure that it looked like the suit fit me, as opposed to having sort of one arm hanging out further on one side than the other.
Yeah, that is not an uncommon problem. Most guys have, one arm that's a little longer than the other, one shoulder that hangs a little lower than the other. It's certainly something that you probably don't notice every day, but it is a very, very common attribute of tailoring.
Yeah, and I think you don't notice it until you have a reason to. I remember for years I thought all of my pants were longer on one side than the other, and what in the heck was wrong with all those people making my pants? It never occurred to me that 20 pairs of pants were all longer on one side. Maybe I was the common factor. So anyway, if we were to go and have a suit custom made, from a timing perspective, how long does that generally kind of take? Is it a couple of days, a couple of months? Where does it fall?
Well, it depends on where you're going. For us here at Balani, we typically quote a 6 to 7 week time frame for us to deliver your suit completely. That's for the suit to come back from the factory, for us to do a final fitting and check up and make sure that everything fits properly and make any necessary alterations or adjustments and get it back to you ready to wear.
Yeah, that's great.
I was going to say that is pretty common in the industry. 6 weeks is about the standard for most places. Some are a little bit more competitive depending on what their size and workload is.
Absolutely. So that kind of brings up another question, which is, what are the steps involved? If we were to come to you and look for a completely custom suit, what should we expect? Do we just come in once and that's it? Or can you lead us through what the steps look like?
Certainly. So you should expect really about 3 visitations, and whether you come to us or we come to you, because we do come to your office or home, if that's more convenient for you. We'll do the initial fitting and consultation, so I'll take all of your measurements. We'll talk about fabric, about your needs, about functionality, about what you're going to be using it for. I'll do the build-out on the suit and send that off to the factory, and as I mentioned, in about 6 weeks, the suit comes back. We get it ready, pressed and ready to wear, and we'll put it on you for the final fitting. Double-check all the alterations, the tailoring, and everything else like that. And if we need to make any further minor adjustments, we can do that and then deliver your suit in about typically 3 to 4 days after that.
That's great. Well, so we talked a little bit about the different colors that you would recommend for an interview. What material should we be looking for if we go in and we actually get to pick the material on the suit? If we're looking for something that maybe we could wear all year round, whenever an interview comes up, what should we look for?
Well, the material that you're looking for is definitely going to be wool. And while there's a lot of great stuff out there in various other types of fabric, like silk and linen and cotton, and all those other things, wool is really the most appropriate for a business suit for a few different reasons. It is a natural fiber, so it breathes really well. I know that most people think of wool as kind of a scratchy, itchy, sort of uncomfortable material, but a lot of your modern wool suitings are actually very, very smooth in the hand and have a great drape. In terms of actual properties of the fabric itself, you should probably be looking for something in a mid to lightweight, depending on your climate. Of course, here in Southern California, we always tend to err on the lighter side because it'll be, I think, 86 degrees today.
Wow.
Middle of February. Yeah, so we get some warm weather and we tend to err on the lighter side. But in terms of wool grading, there's really only a few things that you should concentrate on. The first being weight, so how many ounces per yard the wool is. A good 8.5 ounce fabric is really where I think the best performance is in terms of not only weight and breathability, but also the ability to retain a press and not wrinkle throughout the day. Now, the other thing you'll want to look for is what's called the supers number, or the micron measurement of the actual wool fiber. This is kind of how they grade the fineness of wool. And the micron measurement, actually, the smaller it gets, the larger the supers number is. Now, the reason I mention this is because when it comes to wearing your suit, repeatedly over and over throughout time, you don't want something that's too fine because it'll wear faster. The best wool for everyday wear is probably going to be in the 120s to 140s range, depending on what the base material wool is. A lot of great Australian and New Zealand merino wools are really, really best performed in the 140s and 160s range.
So if we are trying to look for a fabric that uses either the weight that you mentioned or sort of the ranges that you mentioned, where do we get that information? Is it, are we looking at a bolt of fabric and it's at the end, or where is that information found?
Well, typically at Balani, I'll walk my clients through it myself because we have a collection of swatch books that we'll kind of flip through. And depending on what you've told me about what your needs are and everything like that, I will kind of cater that experience and guide you in the direction of several fabrics that, fit for the appropriateness of what we are making. Now, as far as the actual swatches themselves, most of them have a little sticker on it that'll tell you what the weight and the supers number is, or the swatch book itself will have a quick description of exactly what it is you're looking at.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So the other thing is, in terms of accessories, one of my very favorite accessories, and this is kind of jumping away from fabric, but is cufflinks, and I really love them. Do you find that there is a time when they are appropriate or inappropriate? Like, what guidelines do you give around cufflinks?
Cufflinks are great. I really like cufflinks, and I think if more guys wore them, it would be a little more exciting because they're a great method of self-expression. Mm-hmm. A lot of guys don't wear very many accessories in terms of jewelry and other things like that, and cufflinks are a really great, subtle way to sneak in a little bit of your personality. Mm-hmm. As far as appropriateness, I think that for an interview, a job interview, is probably not the right place to wear cufflinks, but they are definitely going to be appropriate for everyday wear, or if you maybe have an important meeting coming up. It's a great way to accessorize your ensemble a little bit more and really add a nice finishing touch. It's a good cherry on the top.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. So I know that you work mainly with men. Do you have an opinion on when ladies wear cufflinks or any suggestions for them?
Yeah, we do almost exclusively men's clothing here at Balani Custom Clothiers, but in terms of women wearing cufflinks, I think it's the exact same rules and guidelines. Women are probably a little bit more accustomed to accessorizing, and I think this just falls right into line with that. It's just a more professional method of doing so.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as a woman myself who likes cufflinks, I can say over the years it's been kind of hard to find cufflinks, and I've ended up purchasing men's cufflinks a number of times. But they are just really, really fun. And they add a little bit to the outfit. I think sometimes you have to look for some cufflinks maybe a little too wild to wear, in certain conservative offices, but...
Yeah, choosing something with maybe a little bit more of a neutral appeal is a pretty good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so, oftentimes when we're looking for a job, we may be on a budget, and it may be because, we're looking for a job that pays more, or maybe we aren't currently working. And if we find ourselves in that situation, we are on a budget, what can we do to really try to look professional for an interview without sort of breaking the bank?
Well, there's a lot of discount suit retailers out there. For men, it depends on what city you live in, but I know in Los Angeles, in our fashion district, there's probably a dozen places where you can kind of swoop in and get a decent-looking suit, at least for one interview, for a couple $100. That having been said, the downfall to that is that you're probably going to wear it a couple of times, and it's not going to hold up very nicely. It'll lose its shape and form, but it'll be good enough for a couple of interviews. Mm-hmm.
It seems like, too, if you follow sales, I've often bought suits like on Black Friday after Thanksgiving, and found that some large retailers will mark down their, off-the-rack suits pretty significantly on that day. And, if you take them to a tailor, sometimes you come out looking all right, for not too much money.
If you're looking to shop sales, Brooks Brothers actually has their semi-annual sale twice a year, once in June, July, and again in December, January. Now, the day after Christmas is really when you want to shop at Brooks Brothers, specifically because they normally have some sort of early bird discount going on or something like that. So you can pick up a really nice suit, for a pretty substantial discount.
Okay, well, that's a good tip. So I mentioned as we got started that I asked on social media if anyone had questions for you, and I probably got more questions than for any other guest. So I think we're going to transition into listener questions. The very first one comes from a listener named Matt, and Matt says, how should your suit be tailored if you are a man who is 5'6", and how do you ensure a timeless look versus a trendy look?
Well, those are actually two great questions, Matt. If you're a gentleman who's maybe 5'8" and below, you're going to want to pay careful attention to a couple of things. Mostly the length of the sleeves, the jacket body, and the length of the trousers. You're going to want to do a trouser that's very slight in the break, a very minimal break, so it doesn't interrupt the silhouette of your legs, and it's visually very lengthening.
So when you say a break, I'm sorry to interrupt. When you say the break, what do you mean?
As far as the length of the trouser, so the break is really how the trouser hits the shoe. The more break, quote unquote, that you have, the longer the pant is.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Perfect. So, again, we're going to want minimal break for a gentleman who's below 5'8", simply because it's more lengthening to the legs visually. Same thing with the jacket body. You don't want it to be too long, or else it's going to kind of cut your legs off a little bit more, and we want to accentuate your height. The sleeve length is also important because you want to be showing a little bit more shirt cuff down at the bottom, and that will also give you a little bit more visual height. Now, depending on your body type, of course, you'll also want to have a garment that's fairly well tapered through the sides. The looser or boxier the garment is, the more that's going to kind of stout you out a little bit more.
Okay.
As far as timeless looks, really what we kind of aim to achieve at Balani is something that you can wear for 10 or 15 years and love and reach for in your closet time and time again. And in order to avoid trends and things like that, you're probably going to want to walk down the middle of the road, so to speak. So don't get a lapel that's too wide or too slim. Don't get anything that's overtly tapered, and certainly the opposite is true. Don't get anything that's too boxy. You'll want something that has kind of again, it depends on your body type, but kind of a medium break, nothing too outlandishly short or long. And certainly a two-button jacket in either a center or side vents is going to be most timeless. Those are things that don't really change with style trends.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious, what if we were really tall? Like, I tend to be on the very tall side. So what if it's a woman or a man who is, like a man who's 6'5", 6'6"? How does that differ in your advice from someone who is shorter?
Well, the opposite is definitely true. So if you're a guy who is 6'6", you don't really need to accentuate your height. You can wear a slightly longer trouser length and certainly a longer coat. As far as the jacket sleeves are concerned, I would still show a little bit of shirt cuff underneath, but maybe not as much as the man who's on the opposite side of the spectrum. In terms of buttons, some guys, if you're above 6'6", you might want to go for a 3-button suit, depending on what's called the button stance, or where the buttons kind of fall on the suit. In custom clothing, I pretty much stick to 2 buttons for the most part, simply because I can adjust that button stance and make it higher or lower, or make the buttons further apart and make it proportionate for a guy. But in off-the-rack suiting, that's not always an option.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So another listener, Michael, asks, what are some common mistakes that everyone makes, and what are some tips to make any suit look great?
Well, I think the most common mistake that I see is that a lot of guys tend to wear their pants too long. More often than not, they end up wearing them on the long side just because they don't want to show their socks or they don't want to be too trendy. But if you wear your trousers too long, what tends to happen is that the heel of your shoe, depending on the width of the pant, will start to kind of catch the bottom and wear your trousers out more than if you had something slightly shorter. The second mistake that I find is typically guys don't show any shirt cuff at the bottom of their coat. So you should definitely have your coat sleeve shortened up a little bit to show some of that shirt cuff, because it creates visual balance between your shirt and tie and your arms. It kind of sets everything in proportion quite nicely.
Okay, that's helpful. And his other question was, do you have any tips to make any suit look great?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that you can do to make to give any suit an extra little boost, and I would say that's having functioning buttonholes cuff in the sleeve. Sometimes it's referred to as surgeon's cuffs. But functioning buttonholes in a jacket really shows that you've kind of the extra mile to make sure that it fits you well. And that's mostly because you can't really undo a buttonhole. It's not like you can alter the sleeve length afterwards. So make sure that the suit fits well, first and foremost, and make sure that the sleeve length is good. But adding functioning buttonholes is just another one of those cherries on the top.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, another listener, Douglas, asks, well, he actually said, "What a cool guest for your show. I would love the proper etiquette confirmed. Should I button my jacket when I have an interview?"
The answer is absolutely yes. You see a lot of guys walking around in various downtown streets with their jackets open, just kind of flapping around. I always button my jacket unless I'm sitting down, and that's especially true in the case of an interview. Mostly because in the instance of an interview, you want to, really kind of display your professional nature, and having your jacket buttoned up is very important. And while we're on that subject, actually, the proper buttoning of a jacket is important as well. If you wear a two-button jacket, only the top button should be buttoned. The bottom one you'll leave open because it allows the coat to drape nicely through the hip and seat. And a three-button, the rule is from top to bottom, sometimes, always, never.
Okay. That's great. In terms of what do you recommend that people keep their pockets empty in their jacket, or is it okay to put a few things in the pockets?
That depends on what the things are and how well tailored your coat is. If you were wearing a really, really slim-fitting jacket, I would probably avoid stuffing it full of various items like cell phones and glasses and wallets and all that other stuff. But if it's tailored with a little bit of room, as a good men's suit should, I would say putting your wallet in your jacket is a little bit more appropriate than your trousers, and it also doesn't cause you to kind of sit lopsided as it does when you wear it in the back pocket of your trouser.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So, another topic that I think is very related, and I actually get this question quite a lot, is what color shirt should someone wear to an interview? Sometimes people ask me, should I wear a pink or purple, or should I wear white? And I have a particular opinion on this, but I'd love to hear sort of your feedback. When you're advising someone, what color shirt do you tell them to look for?
Well, there are various scenarios. If it's an interview in the business world, I would definitely say white or light blue. Those are both very safe colors and allow you to kind of express yourself a little bit more with a tie because they're very color neutral. If it's more of a creative position, you can maybe dabble with a little bit of pattern or maybe a little bit of color, but I would keep it very light. Don't do anything too dark of a shirt, and certainly nothing that's too intense or distracting, because you don't want your interviewer staring at your shirt instead of listening to what you're saying.
Yay, that's exactly my opinion. I'm glad to know that I'm on the right track here. So speaking of tie and other things, we touched on ties, we touched on cufflinks. Are there any other accessories that we should be thinking about adding to our suit, or that we should keep in mind when we get dressed?
Absolutely. You're going to want to have an appropriate shoe wardrobe, and if you wear a suit every day, having one or two pair of shoes is not really going to cut it. If you wear, let's say, a coat 4 times a week, you'll probably want to have 4 pair of shoes that you can rotate. That's not only a condition of wear. You'll wear less, the fewer shoes you have, the faster you'll wear them out. But also in terms of color and variety, it's a great way to use the same suit over and over again, but change up your ensemble enough to make it look like you're not wearing the same thing every day. Mm-hmm. Pocket squares are also pretty important for that as well. Every man should have at least a white pocket square. It goes well, especially in that dressy setting of maybe an interview, to have just a very simple white square that just shows very slightly to match with a white shirt. It's a very clean, sharp, and refined look, and again, just adds a little bit more to the ensemble and lets whoever your audience is know that you've gone the extra mile to really think about what it is that you're wearing.
Mm-hmm. In terms of socks, I'm a little curious. I recently saw a new website. I can't even remember the name. I think it was like sockclub.com or something, to where you subscribe and like every month they send you some new cool socks that you could wear with suits. What do you think about interesting socks when it comes to wearing them with suits?
I am actually a big proponent and a big fan of fun socks. Especially in a world where a lot of guys are kind of the feeling that suits are a little stuffy, mm-hmm. and don't necessarily feel like they can express themselves in them, and that they're a little uncomfortable and almost oppressive. Mm-hmm. Fun socks are really a great way to kind of break away from that. Mm-hmm. Now, for the interview, obviously you're going to want to wear a pair of socks that matches your trouser, just because it's nice and subtle. Mm-hmm. You don't have to worry about it, and it's not going to stand out too much. The same tenet that you would want to use for choosing a shirt, you would want to choose socks based on that same mm-hmm. advice. But that having been said, when you wear a suit every day, if you wear some sort of navy or charcoal day in and day out, it makes sense to kind of, change things up a little bit, add some variety, mm-hmm. get some fun socks, maybe some fun patterns, depending on your locale, brighter colors and things like that. And of course, all of this should probably be something you sort of gauge based on your work environment. Mm-hmm. If it's a very, very conservative environment, well, you may not be able to pull that off. But I think most offices are fairly forgiving about sock etiquette.
So what about tie etiquette? I mean, what should we keep in mind when we pick a tie for a suit that we might wear to an interview?
Keep it simple. The same principle of not trying to distract your audience is applicable to ties as well. Very simple patterns. Solid is maybe a little bit too simple, and in my opinion, a little boring. Mm-hmm. So a good regimental stripe, something that has a very easygoing color pattern. Maybe if you're wearing a navy suit, the tie has navy and gold or navy and red stripes. Mm-hmm. Those are definitely appropriate. And I would stick to primary colors, red, blue, and yellow. Those are going to be the easiest to mix and match with a gray or a navy blue suit and a white or a blue shirt.
I totally agree. And also, I know it seems like men's grooming is really evolving quite a bit lately. I'm seeing a lot more people with different hairstyles, or like with a mustache or a beard. I mean, what are you seeing? And you talk with lots of men who are looking for this special suit. Are you seeing more of that kind of grooming going on?
Yeah, I think that the pendulum swing away from the idea that dressing up as a man kind of makes you a little bit more effeminate. Mm-hmm. We're getting away from that, but we're also getting away from the idea of the metrosexual, mm-hmm. Where somebody who dresses up is too flashy or too peacocky. Mm-hmm. A lot of guys these days are not only dressing themselves a little bit better and kind of looking their best on the regular, but also, kind of expanding their purview in terms of what their look is overall. I think it's much more acceptable these days to have, like you said, a beard or a mustache. I personally have only been clean-shaven maybe about 2 years of my adult life.
Right.
I'm a big fan of the beard.
Right.
But not necessarily in the scruffy sort of Grizzly Adams kind of way. It is okay to have a beard, but keep it trim. Make sure that it's lined up properly, and if you have a good barber, they can definitely make sure that you stay trimmed and neat, and you don't look like will forte in Last Man on Earth.
Those are some really, really good tips. Well, if we've listened to the podcast today and we are still worried about suit etiquette and learning more, are there resources like on the internet or books or things that you might recommend if we're not quite ready to go and actually buy a suit, but we want to learn a little bit more about it? Are there any resources that you might recommend?
Oh, absolutely. Obviously you can go to www.VillaniCustom.com. We have a little bit of information up there, and we're always available to chat if anybody wants to give us a call. Mm-hmm. I would also say GQ has a great online magazine.
Oh, okay.
You can kind of flip through various articles that will give you a good idea of business-appropriate style and things like that. And, of course, there are hundreds of other fashion and style blogs out there, but for the professional man, I would probably start with GQ. If you want to learn a little bit more about timeless style, Alan Flusser, who's a fashion icon, has written a few books, my favorite of which is called Dressing the Man. You can pick it up, I'm sure you can get it in an ebook, but you can certainly pick it up online at Barnes & Noble and things like that.
Okay, that's great. That's really helpful. So we did get one other listener question that was more on the business side of sort of suit making and selling suits. Carlton actually wrote in and he said, with the declining popularity of suits in business, like in the business world, how are tailors marketing themselves differently to try to grow their business?
That's an interesting question, because I've actually, over the last decade or so, seen the rise of the suit, or kind of the renaissance of menswear in general. I think with how competitive the job market is right now, and just the general style appeal of men today, the suit has become more appropriate than it was maybe 10, 15, or 20 years ago. The idea of casual Friday every day is kind of leaving the office. Things are becoming a little bit more professional. So, in general, as a custom clothier, we are seeing a little bit more intrigue and interest. And my prediction is that as more guys start to wear suits and sport jackets and things in a professional nature, we actually will see more interest kind of bubble up from just buying off the rack. A lot of guys now are familiar with buying clothing off the rack, and they're mostly satisfied with it. Some guys fit really, really well into an off the rack suit, but a lot of guys have one thing or another about it that they don't quite like, and that's where we come into play at Balani Custom Clothiers here, not only elevating your wardrobe, but elevating the level of comfort and utility that you get out of a suit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree with you. Actually, at my most recent corporate job a few years ago, I did wear a suit, and I wore a suit almost every single day, as did many of my colleagues. So I could certainly agree with the perspective that, in a way, it is kind of growing in a segment of the sort of working world. Well, I think I have maybe one last question for you. That this is just curiosity. So I love to go to sort of black tie fundraisers, and I find the idea of a custom tuxedo that you own and you keep at home quite interesting as compared to one that you rent from a store. And I'm assuming you probably do tuxedos. Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. We do a lot of tuxedos, not only for black tie formal events, but for weddings and things like that as well.
Yeah. When is the time in life that we should be looking to get our own tuxedo as opposed to be renting one?
Well, I think that depends on the frequency in which you wear it. Everybody hits this point maybe at a little bit different age, but in general, if you have 3 or more formal events that you have to go to a year, you really shouldn't be renting at all. in my world, I don't think any man should be renting a tuxedo in general, but there are those occasions where, maybe you don't wear it that often and it's not really something that you need in your wardrobe, so renting becomes much more practical.
Mm-hmm.
But at the point at which you're going to 2 or 3 formal events every year consistently, you should have something that's made for you for a couple of different reasons. A, fit. It's going to look significantly better on you, and it's also going to be a lot more comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And B, again, it's another method of self-expression. So you don't necessarily need to go with the general run-of-the-mill tuxedo. You can do something a little bit more interesting, whether it's from lapel shape or lining or various other aspects of custom menswear. You can really change things up a little bit and make it a lot more exciting to go to these formal events and occasions.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, so we've covered a ton of different topics. Is there any other advice? Is there anything that we didn't cover that you'd like to share with our listeners?
At any point in time, if any of your listeners have any questions, I really encourage them to reach out to ourselves at Balani Custom Clothiers. We can certainly field any questions we may not have talked about today.
Yeah.
And we're always available for advice just about general, workwear and professional clothing.
Great. And I know you have a location in Los Angeles, is that right? And I
That
mean,
is
you
correct.
have more than one location, I should say.
We do, yeah. We have showrooms in Chicago and Houston. We also have people representing Balani in Los Angeles, which is myself, as well as Cleveland, Columbus, and Orlando.
Oh, that's great. And can you give us the website one more time?
Yes, it's www.BalaniCustom, that's all one word, B as in boy, A-L-A, N as in Nancy, I, custom.com.
Awesome. Well, Landon, thank you so much for joining me. This has been great. I feel like I could ask you questions all day about this topic.
Feel free. Thank you so much for having me on, Angela.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast. And if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher so you never miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.